Good evening, boys and girls. It is late at night once more. I can't sleep, a lot's on my mind, and what do I do when that happens? I make a video and talk to all of you who are perhaps up at this hour or whatever hour it is when you watch this. What has been on my mind lately? Well, love, quite frankly, because, well, this is the corona age. Human connection is greatly sought after, but it is very hard to come by these days. And, some people are making it work, others are not able to find what they're looking for. But since this is a horror channel, and because presumably horror is your life, or at least a big part of it, we're going to do something a little special today. We're going to do kind of part relationship counseling slash therapy, and we're going to do it through the lens of horror films. That's right. Now, romance is something that we typically associate well with the romance genre, or with a romantic comedy, or a drama, or a historical epic, or something like that. But romance and horror have intertwined pretty heavily since the very beginnings of horror, in the film medium and in literature. But at any rate, the way in which relationships are explored, the different levels of healthy versus unhealthy, or they start off healthy and then they degenerate, or whatever. We're going to be talking a little bit about that today. So, as you are watching this, and as you are in whatever stage of whatever relationship quest you are in, whether you're in a relationship already, or you're looking for one, or you just came out of one, maybe it was good, maybe it was bad, who knows? We're going to just talk a little bit about love today, but through the lens of horror, because why not? Now, as far as romance and horror, those two things are not usually what you think of when you associate those genres together, but they should definitely be talked about together because, well, we can look back at something as old as, say, the 1925 Phantom of the Opera, and we tend to have some of the classic tropes of horror, insofar as there can be anything described as romantic, where you have some form of star-crossed lovers, or you have the monster, whether it's a human monster or a gill man here. That they have their eyes on some beautiful girl, and they have the standard trope where they carry her off, and the valiant hero has to track her down and kill the monster, all that stuff, standard Beauty and the Beast type stuff. But it's as old as time, really. It's as old as film, and you can have it be something like the Phantom of the Opera here, where Christine has pity on the Phantom for being deformed, but obviously doesn't want to be with him. And of course, in the later musical adaptation on the stage, that gets exacerbated quite a lot more. But the foundations for it are here, and that's about as classic as you can get. And of course, the monster in question doesn't have to be a human; it can be a gill man, like our dear gill man from Creature from the Black Lagoon. But same kind of trope, except he can't speak. Of course, he just kind of croaks. But same thing, and that's about as classic as you can get. It's very, very old, but it's primal. It's an old tale of Beauty and Beast, and of the outsider wanting the popular girl. That's usually the metaphor that they're playing off of in some form or fashion. And I think a lot of us, if we're especially if we're guys, can relate to the monster who's usually a masculine force that is deformed or is monstrous in some way, who wants the beautiful popular girl, and obviously, because he's a monster or whatever, can't have her. I mean, that's such an old archetype, and I'm sure it works the other way as well, but just you don't see that one as much. But anyway, that's about as basic as you can get. Now, what happens if you want to go a little bit different, a little bit more off the beaten track? Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to get into several different categories of horror films and romance. We're going to get into First of all, we're gonna talk about some like relatively healthy, or if like relatively healthy, like things that have certain positive aspects to them in horror films, kind of healthy relationships of varying sorts. We'll get into some not so healthy relationships, and there are a lot of those in the horror genre because, well, it's part of the conflict. Got to have conflict in the story. We're gonna get into just kind of casual hookups, nothing too serious. We'll get into LGBTQ in horror, and unfortunately, I'm sure there are far, far more films that deal with this more in depth than the ones I have. But, there are also a lot of films in the various categories that I don't have, but like the ones that I have either are explicit or implicit in that department. And then at the very end, we'll get to ones that are considered kind of taboo in some way or just flat out wrong. Because again, this is horror, it covers a pretty wide spectrum. Now, we're going to start off with some healthy ones. What do you want in your relationship, ideally? Well, I mean, the answer is different for everyone, but presumably you would want someone that, would stand up for you and would fight through thick and thin to protect you or to, give you what you need in some way. And we already looked at some attempts at that. These particular monsters here are not successful at that. But they come at it from, well, a stereotypically masculine heterosexual perspective. But, an example of one where the monster, is a female here is an underworld here with Celine. She's a vampire, and I guess technically the guy, he's a wasn't he a werewolf? Yeah, it's yeah. So I only saw this once like years ago, but if I recall, the whole idea is that she has to protect him because the vampires have a war with the werewolves, the lycans, and she's trying to protect him and falls in love with him and all that kind of stuff. But so you can have an example of someone that, whether it's a man or woman, this is a woman in this case, but somebody that, is willing to kind of go the extra mile to either protect you physically or just meet your needs or to show devotion in some way. And this is kind of what you see in something like this. And it's not every day that the monster is, female, but it definitely can happen. And this is an example of that. Obviously, launched a franchise and, was a star-making vehicle for Kate Beckinsale. I mean, she was already in Pearl Harbor and Much Ado About Nothing and several other things, but this one made her like a headliner for sure. And so I think that's kind of an interesting little parallel there. And kind of similarly on the devotion side of things, so these have different themes. We'll talk a little bit about what happens when you find someone that is devoted to you and is willing to go the extra mile and to do what it takes to make things work. You might end up with a Bram Stoker's Dracula situation and another vampire film. And again, not entirely healthy because, well, if a relationship was entirely healthy in the horror genre, it probably wouldn't be a horror film. But here you have an example of Dracula in the prologue, which the prologue is not in the book, even though it is called Bram Stoker's Dracula. And as far as feature films go, this one's by far the most accurate to the book because James Rolfe did that, which Dracula's the most faithful video, and the one that he gave the title to was the BBC miniseries, which, as if you're counting that as well, then sure, yeah, that would count, or that would probably make it. But as far as like singular feature films, it would definitely be this one. But yeah, the prologue is not in the book, but it involves Dracula, who they explicitly say is Vlad the Impaler, which I think they allude to it in the book, but it's made more explicit here. And obviously Vlad the Impaler did inspire Dracula as a character, but his love, Elizabeta, thinks that he's dead and she kills herself, and so then he gives himself over to the dark powers and becomes a vampire. And so as we all perhaps everyone who's seen this film knows the line, "I have crossed oceans of time to find you." And it's something that, yes, he is alive for centuries, and he finds the reincarnated soul of his lost love, and there seems to be a connection between them that Mina can't explain, and that sort of thing. And it's endemic of someone that is willing to wait a long time and is willing to do what it takes to make true love work. That's what he strives for. Doesn't really fully succeed at that, obviously, because he dies. But spoilers. But still, that's the intention there. Now, I've been talking to people about like this kind of love, like this kind of like really passionate, 1800s romantic, horror literature kind of love, in novels that I grew up loving, like Frankenstein and Dracula and like Wuthering Heights, which it has some supernatural elements to it, but it's mostly a romantic drama book. But literature of that era, which this definitely, it's kind of on the tail end of it, but it counts. And I've been talking to people about that, and they're like, "Oh, that's not healthy. It's not real. It's not this and that may indeed be true." I am not the expert, but I assume that it perhaps doesn't have a place in our modern world. I don't know. The rules have changed since coronavirus, and what better person is there to talk to all of you about relationships than someone who cannot make a relationship work to save his life, let alone many friendships? But anyway, that's a good, solid example of that kind of love that may or may not exist. We don't know, but it's there. And then similar time period, different continent, different genre or subgenre, and different kind of devotion is something like in Bone Tomahawk, where Patrick Wilson's character, he was kind of stupid and he fell off the roof while trying to fix it, and he broke his leg, and his wife's a medical doctor, very smart, very capable. They seem like they have a good relationship where she kind of points out his stupidity, but he trusts that she knows what she's talking about. And but when she gets kidnapped by this tribe of cannibalistic kind of deformed Native Americans, he and the sheriff and a few others go off to rescue her. And keep in mind that he has a broken leg in the story, and this is in the Old West, and the means by which one would tend to such a thing are not as advanced as they are today. I don't think it was. You could have broken your leg and you could have theoretically had it heal at that time, but still, it's not quite as good as it is today. But despite all of that, he goes on horseback with the sheriff, with everybody that wants to go along, and he really suffers to go and find her, and like to the point where you're like, man, like I was sitting there and I was like, well, if you got a broken leg that badly, it's like I would think you'd be more of a detriment to the party than anybody else, except they have an interesting balance where yeah, he would be holding it up, but at the same time, like, does he persevere. He puts up with more in the way of that messed up leg than I would have thought anybody could. And surprisingly, spoilers, he does make it to the end and manages to save her. And it's like, wow, that I did not expect that. So I had a tremendous props to S. Craig Zahler for defying my expectations, and I think the expectations of the audience, because we're looking at him with his broken leg and we're like, this is just a ticking time bomb right here. But no, he just plows through, soldiers on, puts his big boy pants on and does what he needs to do in spite of his broken leg. And it's like, well, that's what I would hope I would do in those circumstances. And I'm pretty sure I would. I think I have what it takes there. I mean, especially at that time when it's not like, you could trust that, whatever your police department or your whatever, like you could work directly with them, but you wouldn't necessarily, to get in the way would be to inhibit the investigation or something like that, but in whatever capacity, I would definitely be the kind of person to, go to the ends of the earth to find, that person, or to do whatever I needed to do. um, and then we have a different kind of subset of the devotional side of romance that is somewhat healthy. We have the trope that you'll see in a lot of superhero films, which typically the superhero is male, and the woman in the story is without powers. Usually, it's not always this case, but that in that mold, you'll find the hero who has some kind of power and some kind of great responsibility that is trying to find the best usages of both, and usually the woman's purpose is to kind of help him become the hero he needs to be. And you see them in the horror genre in different ways. Now, these are kind of horror comedies with, you could argue, some superheroic aspects, such as like the Toxic Avenger, signed by Lloyd Kaufman. And this one, I think, is most definitely a superhero, but it also gets thrown into the horror genre as well as comedy. And that's what you gotta love about Troma films, is that they are a unique fusion of genres in such a way that only Lloyd Kaufman could do. And I'm very, pleased about that, obviously, because I like films that break the mold. And in here, we've got our dear Melvin, who becomes the Toxic Avenger and is horrifically deformed, and yet at the same time, he becomes a monster with superhuman, size and strength, and, he goes about cleaning up the streets, but also getting some degree of revenge against the bullies that, were giving him a hard time and threw him in the acid, or in the toxic waste in the first place. And, so you do get some aspects of personal revenge, and you also get some aspects of superhero justice, and you have the citizens of Tromaville with the, I think it was the mayor. You get some of those like Frankenstein archetypes there, but then with the his blind girlfriend, she fulfills and actually the inspiration for that character was the blind flower girl in City Lights, my favorite film of all time, and which is a really good comparison, good source to draw from. But in there, it's kind of similar as far as like someone that kind of helps the hero become who he needs to be. And again, that's a trope we've seen over and over again in superhero stories, but you can see it in a superhero horror comedy, fusion film like this. And then this one's not really regarded as a, superhero film necessarily, but it definitely fits that same trope, but in a different sense, which is the Velocipaster. And this is, I love this film. If you haven't seen it, please just drop what you're doing right now and see it, because it's just so beautiful. I love it. But in here, it's the same kind of thing of like the priest who, in a kind of werewolf fashion, turns into a really, really fake, stupid looking velociraptor, but it's so great. It's so perfect. It's just as stupid as you'd want it to be. But, she helps him realize that his curse can be used for good. And, she kind of helps to bring out this side of him that wouldn't normally be brought out. And, and I think that a good relationship, ideally, is one in which, your partner would bring out the best in you, and you for them. That's what you would hope. And again, it's through a absurd lens here, but I think that essential idea is in there. And preferably through thick and thin, and to try and make you into the best version of yourself. Now, granted, what they tell me is, like, for a healthy relationship, you have to be okay with the person where they're at, and that's, I suppose, a fair rebuttal, but at the same time, I would hope that a healthy relationship would make you a better person and your partner better, for the two of you together. Like, together, you're stronger than you are apart. And especially when times get tough, such as in the case of my favorite installment in the Return of the Living Dead series, Return of the Living Dead 3. And here is an example of kind of the opposite of what we just talked about, where it's the woman who, in this case, it's kind of the gift and the curse, similar to both previous films we talked about. Here, she, becomes, she gets injected with the substance. It was I think a gas in the previous two, and then here it's like I believe it's it's a chemical injection there, but it brings her back to life when she seemingly dies. But like clinically, she's dead. She doesn't have a heartbeat. She doesn't feel right. Food doesn't stay down. The only thing that makes the pain go away is human flesh, and that's one of the unique things about the Return of the Living Dead zombies is they can talk, or not flesh, brains. Sorry, yes. That's the thing that makes the Return of the Living Dead films unique, is that the zombies, they can speak. They do have agency of some kind. They can articulate how they're feeling, and they make it clear what they want and why they want it, which is they want brains because consuming brains makes the pain go away. And the pain of being dead, the pain of the gas, the way that it makes them feel, that particular chemical. And here, it's the same kind of thing. And so part of why she has all these sharp objects stuck into her is to try and give her something else to make to kind of distract her from the other kinds of pain. And it makes for a great look, a great cosplay look, but I think it also goes to show that sometimes when a person is suffering, they'll be doing something else to themselves to try and make the pain go away, like especially if they start to drink a lot, or they do something to try and dull the pain, but preferably, they don't, it could be anything. They could be wanting to be alone more, they could be wanting to do something out of the realm of what they would normally do. And so in here, it's more of a matter of, sticking by your partner and being able to help them see it through, ideally. And in this case, it's another situation where it doesn't end happily for either of them, but at least they're together when it happens. And, it's something that I think that's something that I think we can all hope for, is that someone can be with us in the good times as well as the bad, that we don't have a fair weather relationship. And so now we kind of start to transition from the relatively healthy examples to some of the not so healthy examples. And this next pairing in the same series, you could kind of put them in either category, I suppose. They kind of straddle that line. They most definitely arise from unhealthy situations, which, can't necessarily be helped, really, in a lot of ways. But we're going to talk specifically about the David Cronenberg remake of The Fly, which, part of what made this film so successful was the fact that it had a love story that people really grew attached to the point where they had to shoot several different versions of the ending, and then they eventually ended it at a very specific place that seemed to... And they ended it at the right place, I think. They ended it at the place where the emotional apex had been reached, and there was no real way you could top it or do something that would be satisfactory. And so I'm glad that they cut those endings. But, here you have an unusual romance from, your nerdy scientist and this female journalist, so kind of a, Clark Kent and Lois Lane kind of situation, except it's more like if you took somebody like a Lois Lane type of character, a journalist, and then merged it with like a Bruce Banner, instead of Superman, who's born with his powers, or born with the specific genetic makeup that gives him these great powers when he's on Earth and exposed to Earth's yellow sun. But anyway, it definitely has a lot in common with something like the Hulk or a character that's brought about through some kind of scientific accident, and preferably, in the case of something like the Hulk, where the gift is also a curse. But here it's a little different because the transformation, you think that it's like and unlike the original 1958 Fly, this Fly, Seth Brundle, he gets in the telepod, and when he gets out on the other side, he seems to be perfectly normal, which that was a changeover from the original. He seems to be okay, but then he seems to be more than okay. He seems to have increased. He seems to have the proportionate strength, speed, and agility of a fly. And so, when he's doing all these extraordinary superhuman things, you're like, oh, well, this could easily turn into Spider-Man or something like that. This is like classic Marvel superhero archetype here. But then, of course, the horrific side effects start to gradually take shape, where he, likes sugar and sweet things, and he starts to get very manic and very impatient. He has tremendous sexual prowess, but he also is a bit of a thrill seeker. All of a sudden, a kind of like a drug addict almost. And some people read this as a metaphor for AIDS. I think you could easily make that case. You could also easily make the case that it's as much of a metaphor for like drug addiction, or perhaps you could say, having acquired HIV or AIDS from being a drug addict, because it's the same kind of thing where, like, at first it's great, they're really high energy, go, 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 and then you can't keep up, and then it's like, well, you're a drag, I'm going to find somebody who can keep up, and then they just start to gradually waste away. And, in this case, he turns into a Brundle fly, and just true physical degradation. It's really horrific. But, in this respect, it's kind of the opposite of like a Return of the Living Dead 3 situation, where this person is trying to, he tries to save her life, and what ends up happening is destructive, but he's, tries to be there for her through the whole thing. Here, this is an example of someone who did something to themselves that one person in the relationship couldn't control, and the consequences of that choice are such that the relationship can't function in a healthy way, because one member in the relationship, one person is going down a path that the other person can't or won't go down. And that could be an addiction, it could be a disease, it could be a disease acquired from the addiction, whatever it is. One person's going down a path that the other person can't go down. And I think you find that happens a lot with relationships, and especially with substance abuse. You'll find that having played a tremendous role in a lot of people's lives, and and also just the various steps of the thing. There's parts of both of them that want things to get back to the way they were despite the circumstances, but then this person is so entrenched in whatever the consequences of those choices are, and also in this case trying to find a cure, and trying to the obsession with it becomes a quest in and of itself. And again, you got some Beauty and the Beast archetypes here, but it's more, I think, of an example of how you can have something, a wedge of some kind, usually brought about by one person's choice, that drives the relationship apart. And that is all too common, unfortunately, and it can be an addiction or an obsession or some kind of trauma that happens to a person that makes them waste away or emotionally drift away in some way. And then a different kind of constraint, a different set of circumstances is in the Fly 2 here. This is an example of a relationship that does work out, but the circumstances by which it arises are not the most ideal. And like, I could have put it in the other one, but it's such that I put it more in the negative category, just because the circumstances in which the relationship arises and all of the hurdles that it has to go through are such that the probability of such a relationship working out in the long term is not as great as it otherwise might be. What do I mean by that? Well, this is Martin Brundle, Seth Brundle's son, who was impregnated in. It was Ronnie. Was it Ronnie? Is that her name? Um, yeah, the she gets pregnant, in the first movie, gives birth here, and because his genetic material, Martin's genetic material, he is part human, part Brundlefly, and so he has certain metamorphical, if that's a word, um, aspects of a fly in the sense that he ages very rapidly. So, like, by the time he's 5, he is physically much older than a 5-year-old, normal human 5-year-old. And, and he's basically raised in captivity. And while he physically is mature, he emotionally is still pretty behind where he otherwise would be if his physical age reflected his actual age. And, I think that you can definitely you could argue it's kind of a metaphor for people that are raised in really sheltered environments. Maybe they're homeschooled and not sufficiently socialized. Maybe they have some kind of disability, or some kind of something that they have to deal with, like autism, or something that makes it such that normal socialization is difficult. And in this case, he does manage to find someone and does manage to find a relationship, and despite all of that. But again, the circumstances surrounding it are such that any relationship born under those circumstances is going to have a lot more hurdles to overcome down the road. And if you have read the comic sequel to this film called The Fly Outbreak, then you see just what those difficulties are, and they do present themselves. So that's another reason why I put it in the slightly negative category. But yeah, if the difficulties of that kind of upbringing, if they don't make themselves clear right away, then they probably will down the road in some way, and that's just something that both parties will have to realize and work together to overcome. Now, as far as problems in a relationship, you can definitely run into quite a lot of them, and horror movies certainly do their fair share of showing that. Um, you can have instances where you see that your relationship is beginning to decline in some way, and there are various ways in which people try to salvage that relationship. And, you know, there are different ways that people do it in life and in movies. Good example is well, this is all the Paranormal Activities all together, but I'm thinking in the first one particularly, you have the relationship between Katy and Mika. And in the first film, I remembered really hating Mika, especially when I first saw the first film. I've felt less severely this way the more times I've seen the first film, but when I first saw it, I remembered really actively hating Mika. But again, the severity of it has decreased with time. But even so, it's so the whole conceit is that Katy feels like she is seeing or is being followed by some kind of supernatural presence, and so he says, well, yeah, 'cause he's a filmmaker in the story, so he's like, well, I'm gonna set up cameras and we're gonna just see what we see. Maybe we can catch a sign or whatever. And I think that the big problem there is that they're a couple that I cannot remember if they're married yet. I don't think so, but I think they're on the cusp of it. I could be wrong. I cannot remember that part. But at any rate, whether it's a relation, I don't think they were married at this point, but at any rate, they're in a relationship, and it's such that the steps that Mika goes to document what's going on in the house, the steps that he goes through, I think he takes it way too far. I think he does it in a way that kind of mocks Katy's concerns and her fears, and it doesn't help make the situation any better. If anything, it makes it worse. I think he shows quite a lot of lack of support in, even if he doesn't believe that what's happening is real or whatever, he could at least respect the fact that she believes that it's really happening to her. Because even if it wasn't, just the fact that she believes it to be true, that can be enough to cause a lot of damage to your partner and to the relationship. And so, if you really cared about the person, you would see it through, through thick and thin. And you know like, there was nothing wrong with setting up the cameras, but it's like the motivation for it and the degrees that it goes towards, I think, just flat out mockery. I don't think that that's healthy at all. And so I remembered feeling really glad when he flies at the camera, and I was like, good, fucker's dead. But while I have it in front of me, you also have one of the installments in the series that a lot of people didn't like. Like, I'm thinking of, like, Brad Jones, the cinema snob, in his worst of 2012. He and his friend Jake put that on their worst of lists, and one of the descriptors that Brad Jones used was teeny. For the fourth one was a teeny bopper girl and her date rapey boyfriend, which I don't recall the date rapey part. Like, it, which again, like, I'm not really one to take such an insight from. It's a long story, but anyway, I'm not really one to take that kind of thing seriously, that kind of accusation seriously, considering the source. But I remembered when I watched it, I thought, that these two kids, I thought that they seemed like they were best friends as well as people that were in a relationship together, and they didn't do a lot of what you see with young people relationships in a lot of movies these days, where they didn't, like, trash talk each other, they didn't, like, go behind each other's back. Like, they just seemed like they were just normal kids that were friends, and they were in love with each other. So, and not, like, overly complicated, because they're still high school kids or whatever, but felt pretty genuine to me. That could just be me, I don't know. And then an example of one in which the couple is married, and it's pretty clear that this specific kind of thing is really driving a wedge into the relationship, is in one of my favorite found footage films, Willow Creek, about the search for Bigfoot, and directed by Bobcat Goldthwait, who is a comedian normally, but he also directed this film, and he did Shakes the Clown. He starred in that. And this is an example of one in which the guy is like a believer in Bigfoot, and he really wants to see if he can find himself a Bigfoot and capture it on camera. And then his wife, they are a girlfriend. Sorry, wow. I could have sworn they were married, but no, girlfriend. But anyway, same kind of conceit there, where, like, his obsession is such that he wants to really go for it, and she kind of rolls her eyes at him the whole time. And it seems like it's going to be one of those things that would really drive a wedge through in their relationship going through the long term. And basically what that said to me was, like, well, if you have someone that has hobbies or interests that maybe you don't feel quite the same way, maybe you don't understand it fully, but you would hope that they would respect the other person's hobbies or interests, such that they could at least not complain while they're going along with you, or maybe they could learn to like it, or maybe they could just go along because it's important to them or whatever. It's that respect factor, I think, that's missing here. And one would hope that in a relationship that one would have that. And then we get into a kind of special category where we're starting to transition into specific types of unhealthy relationships, which in this case, this is kind of in the same archetype as what we already looked at in terms of the the monster pining after someone, or in this case, mourning the loss of someone that he loves so much, and then becoming monstrous out of grief and a sense of needing revenge against those who wronged him and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of in the same vein as what we looked at before, but slightly different, and it is Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, and it's a musical and horror film adapted from the stage musical of the same name by, was it Stephen Sondheim? And trying to make sure that's correct. Yes, Stephen Sondheim, and here we have someone whose wife was killed, presumably, and his daughter is set to marry his wife's murderer, and he got exiled, and so many years go by, and he finally comes back to London to kind of get his revenge on Judge Turpin, who wronged him. But in his quest for revenge and his sense of loss, it overcomes his humanity to where he, is merely a shadow of his former self. And, his quest for revenge really begins to cloud not only his judgment and his morality, but also his original motivations for why he is doing what he's doing. Like the revenge aspect, the murderous aspects, they have kind of taken on a life of their own. And spoilers, his wife is not dead. She just, is the insane homeless woman that he doesn't even recognize, and he accidentally kills his own wife without realizing it. And he's about to do the same with his daughter unknowingly, but luckily, manages to spare her in time. And sorry, it's just there's a sticker on the back that I noticed. That's why I'm trying to pick it, but it's not coming off. Anyway, almost kills his daughter without realizing who she is, and but he remembers her as a baby, but not as an adult, a young woman, and of course his wife, doesn't recognize her either. So I mean, you can get into these situations where somebody becomes so obsessed with the idea of a person that they lose sight of the person in front of them. They lose sight of realities. They just lose their sense of priorities, or something along those lines. And I think this definitely shows that, but of course through the horror lens, as we love. And now we start to get into the realm of obsessive, controlling relationships, where one person is not letting the other person breathe and be themselves and do what they want to do with their lives. And traditionally, in a lot of relationships, but especially on film, that seems to manifest itself in the man trying to control the woman, but obviously the opposite can happen in real life, and I assume on film, but it's a little less common, or it seems to be, if the incidents may not be reported as much, whatever. First up is an example, probably my favorite slasher film of all time, the original Black Christmas from 1974, and this is an example of, you have Olivia Hussey, who was one of the most beautiful women of her generation and a great actress, very memorable Juliet in the Franco Zeffirelli version, and Keir Dullea, who I've met in person. He plays her boyfriend who impregnated her, and she's a college girl, impregnated her, and he wants her to get married to him and settle down and raise kids and kind of give up her future, and she's like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have this baby. I don't want what you're wanting from me. I want to be my own person. I want to have some say in what I do, not only with my body but with my life. And this was 1974, so this is definitely third wave feminism when it was first kind of coming onto the scene. It was the attempt at the Equal Rights Amendment, to get going, So it's definitely in that mold. But I think what it tells us is that, both parties need to feel like they have something to contribute to the relationship, and that their voices are being heard, and that they're allowed to be themselves, because when they're not, then things can get really ugly. And spoilers, for quite a long time in this film, they set up Keir Dulia's character as being the red herring. Like, you think he's the one doing all the killing, but the beauty of this film is you never find out who the killer is. You never learn his real name. You never see his face outside of this. That's all you see. You don't know why he's doing it. And the ending is just really, really chilling. It's really just, it stays with you. And it's just a masterpiece. And it came out before Halloween, but it uses a lot of techniques that Halloween would later, that would enter the mainstream thanks to Halloween, but this movie did it first, like with the first person camera and that sort of thing. And series of killings around holiday as well. But yeah, definitely, if one person's not allowing the other person to be fully themselves, then you got a problem. So much so that it might devolve into an extreme case of someone having to physically run away from their abusive former significant other, and having to hide and to try to do everything that person can to get away from this person, such as in the Leigh Whannell 2020 Invisible Man, which this one definitely did do a lot different from the original story and the original line of Universal Invisible Man films. And I think in a pretty refreshing way, because one thing that you will hear a lot in the discourse these days, and with like people I know, and I think talk to most women, and they'll have experiences with either some form of sexual assault or harassment, or in this case, it's more of either a stalkerish boyfriend or an abusive boyfriend, or something along those lines, something that is not a good, healthy example of what a relationship's supposed to be. And in this case, this is pretty extreme, and obviously through a sci-fi horror lens with the Invisible Man suit, which that's kind of refreshing that it's a suit and not a serum or something like that. But if anything, it kind of, again, similar to The Fly, this could easily go into like Tony Stark superhero territory, but it doesn't. But it's more like, technological genius with a special suit that gives him powers, so it's like you can't not make the comparison. But yeah, it's here where it's someone who's extremely controlling, someone who is obsessive, and who thinks through every aspect of how to control someone's life, and will do anything to enforce that control, up to and including, ruining a person's life, framing her for murder, and, making her look like she's insane, that sort of thing. Very extreme stuff, but, there have been cases of severe gaslighting, or people, like, breaking doors down, or, any number of things. But this does convey that kind of relationship very, very well, and I would not recommend seeing it until you're in the proper headspace, because it can be quite, I'm sure that if you have whatever trauma, then it'll probably bring it up to the surface again. And that's specifically with a relationship that is, well, abusive and controlling, but the person tries to run away and tries to escape and be free of this person. What you may find is that someone is so entrenched in the abuse that the person doesn't necessarily realize that they are having to undergo so much abuse, such as in the case of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining. Now, of course, controversial point, which is that the character of Jack Torrance, Kubrick's vision for that character was someone who seems to have a few screws loose already, as portrayed by Jack Nicholson, such that when the cabin fever really sets in, that it's less of the supernatural controlling or destroying an otherwise good man, which is a metaphor for alcoholism. And of course, alcohol is still very much a part of, well, Kubrick's film and the original Stephen King novel and the miniseries that's more faithful to the book. It's definitely still a factor, but you get more of the sense that this Jack Torrance is more of an abusive person in general, and that alcohol just kind of exacerbates it, or rather brings out what's there, where perhaps he, maybe he's not like that all the time, but, abusive people can often be that way, where they're not monsters all the time, and they're monsters infrequently enough to where the person having to undergo the abuse is able to make up all kinds of rationalizations. And you definitely get the sense with Shelley Duvall's character Wendy, you get the sense that she is someone who probably subconsciously knows the kind of man her husband is, but is trying to do her best to you rationalize it or try to make sense of it, because she seems like she's rather repressed herself, because she wears those, like, the blue and red kind of Raggedy Ann type dresses, and it's very, very like little girlish, and so she probably is heavily repressed, and it's such that she probably doesn't want to directly confront the realities of what she's going through with her husband, and that's different than, like, in the miniseries. You have this far more, like, classically attractive woman playing Wendy, and the relationship seems to be fairly solid until well, the spirits start working on Jack and his alcoholism comes back and that sort of thing. Like, it's not perfect, because of course with the alcoholism, like, it's still very much a part of their recent past, and it still divides them as a couple, but you get the sense that their foundation is stronger and made on healthier ground than it is in Kubrick's version. But again, I think that he was able to psychologically highlight what an abusive person really looks like, and what can happen when that person goes really, really off the rails and is unhinged. And in this case, it's through alcoholism slash supernatural influence slash cabin fever, bringing out the worst in people, that sort of thing. And you could easily do a story like this today, and you wouldn't even need the supernatural. You could just use coronavirus, or something like it. And again, there are a lot of theories people have with this film that, oh, the ghosts aren't real, it's all in Jack Nicholson's head. And could be, could very well be. But yeah, this version of it is a good portrayal of what that kind of abusive relationship looks like. The one where the other party isn't fully subconsciously aware of what all they're going through and is trying to kind of rationalize their way out of it. And then a different kind of abusive relationship is one in which people play mind games on their partner. Now, in this case, this is kind of a unique case, because there aren't a whole lot of cases that I know of that are like this, but David Cronenberg's he has so many good films, but this is regarded as being one of his best, but also one of the best Canadian films of all time by the, I think it's the Canadian, whatever it is. It's not the Canadian Film Institute. It's like the Canadian Film Awards, whatever it is. It's not the same. Might be like whatever their film academy is. They chose this, like, on several different lists for the top 10 best Canadian films, but it's his Dead Ringers. And I guess that this was inspired by, like, a real case, I guess, but it's these twins, expertly played by Jeremy Irons, who, I love Jeremy Irons, but yeah, he plays twins. He does so good with both roles. He plays twins that are brilliant medical doctors, I believe surgeons, and they share everything. They have the same practice. They went to medical school together, and they tend to share the same women. And they will often play mind games with their women. But not only does this cover what happens when one person doesn't want to keep living that way anymore, but also when one of them at some point, one of them gets addicted to drugs, and then the other one gets addicted to drugs also, kind of as a way to keep up, and also because, well, and this is true, they've confirmed this with a lot of studies, but oftentimes, and these twins were together, but like oftentimes you'll see stories of like twins that were separated at birth and they didn't know that the other existed, but they ended up living eerily similar lives. Like so similar that you would have sworn that they made it up, but no, it really happened. In this case, it's something that there's a lot of mind games. There's a lot of just manipulation, and it's a really, really unusual film, and I mean that in the best possible way. Highly recommend it. It's, I don't know what you would even call it, really. Horror film, psychological thriller, drama, all those things. It's very unique, so I'd highly recommend it. And then perhaps you are either in a relationship or you're attempting to get into a relationship with someone that has something that blocks them from going all the way with it or from reciprocating your feelings. And that can come from a variety of sources. Perhaps with mind games, like we saw, or perhaps the person is a narcissist and perhaps they only care about themselves and gratification of their own egos, such as in the case of a great double feature of, I'm specifically talking about Vampire's Kiss, not High Spirits, but Vampire's Kiss and American Psycho. So with Vampire's Kiss, we have Peter Lowe, played by Nicolas Cage, in probably his funniest role of all time. One of the funniest movies I've ever seen in my life, is Vampire's Kiss, and it's kind of a dark comedy with some horror elements to it, but I think it's hilarious personally. But he is most definitely a narcissist, very much a Patrick Bateman type, except that he's a literary agent instead of a Wall Street guy, but still in New York City. And, he is somebody, he's still cut from that 80s New York City mold of like being extremely narcissistic, extremely ego-driven, egocentrism, hedonism, all that kind of stuff. And you get the sense that it's part of his delusions are brought about by the kind of life that he lives, that he's very self-isolating, given the fact that his mental and physical walls are up to where he can't really form meaningful connections with people on any kind of level, whether it's friendship or relationships. And it's such that it really does inhibit his ability to connect with other people. And it's through a very, very, I think, very darkly comedic lens, and he just, man, does Nicolas Cage give it his all in this role. It's so funny. But yeah, I think this does have quite a lot to say about someone who was not only losing touch with reality, but they're so egocentric and ego-driven that they just cannot connect with other people, and in this case he thinks he's turning into a vampire. But then you have something like American Psycho, which it's more ambiguous as far as whether or not the killings that he's presumably doing, whether they're really happening or they're all in his mind. The novel blurs those lines significantly more than the movie does. The movie, there are definitely hints at it that, these things that you're seeing may not be literally happening, especially when the ending kind of muddies the waters deliberately. The book definitely, because the killings happen pretty infrequently and pretty nonchalantly, kind of mixed in with these other chapters that go into long descriptions of what everyone was wearing, and the fact that everybody pretty much looks the same, and they're just, the murder scenes are just kind of thrown in there pretty nonchalantly. Like, one of the titles, or one of the chapter titles, I think, is Tuesday, and so it's like really, really casual, and that's part of what makes the book chilling, is that that Patrick Bateman really doesn't think about these killings or these horrible things he's doing. He doesn't really think about them too readily. They're just part of his life. And you do get an evocation of that in the film, for sure. But they both do stem from someone who is extremely narcissistic, extremely egomaniacal, and in this case, quite possibly psychopathic in the clinical sense of the word. Even if the killings are not literally happening, he definitely matches the dictionary definition of a psychopath. Someone that cannot empathize with others, who uses others for his own pleasure, and he derives pleasure from other people's pain and that sort of thing. And it's definitely worth watching for that reason. I kind of like to think that I like to think that perhaps the killings aren't happening at all, and perhaps it's someone who is just losing touch with his identity, and with being so obsessed with his image and so obsessed with fitting in, that he just loses touch with himself and what's important in life, despite the fact that he does at one point seem to kind of have somewhat of a cry for help, in the sense that his secretary, who in both the book and the movie, he knows for a fact loves him, or at least he says that she does. Here in the film, it's because you see, how she's responding to him. You get the sense that, well, it's less through the lens of a unreliable narrator, and that, yeah, she probably does have some feelings for him, or at least, quite a bit of loyalty or whatever. You get the sense that, like, he could have had a chance with somebody if he really meant what he said, which was that he wants to have a meaningful relationship with someone special. And of course, as he's got the nail gun right up to her head without her knowing, and he doesn't pull the trigger, he spares her. And you get the sense that perhaps that is a cry for help, but also, if he were to have tried, then he probably would have hurt her in more ways than one. And that can definitely happen with narcissists. Or maybe it's not narcissism, maybe it's some other kind of problem that's holding someone back, like in Cat People, the original Cat People. In this case, when the main character, when she's sexually aroused by a man, she turns into this cat person, into a large cat person, which you actually never see, which is partially because, well, the effects of the time probably wouldn't have made anything really convincing, but also it does lend some mystery. And the Val Lewton produced films in the 40s and 50s, they were amazing at they had these really lurid drive-in kind of titles. I think back before the heyday of the drive-in, but they had these really lurid titles made for RKO, but then he hired people like was it Jacques Tourneur? You hired people like that who brought such a visual flair and richness to it that the films are far deeper and far more artistically rich and meaningful than the titles would necessarily suggest. And in this case, it's someone who's, I think, perhaps somewhat sexually repressed, but also someone who has something, in this case, a curse, but, someone who has something that is holding her back from giving herself fully to another person. And that can definitely manifest with either repression or some kind of trauma that keeps getting in the way of the relationship, where the person just kind of is afraid of intimacy because they're afraid of being vulnerable. And that can definitely happen. And this is a good example of that. Or perhaps it's not really a conventional romance in the conventional sense. Perhaps it's a connection of minds, or a perceived connection of minds, or some kind of way in which a person feels like they know someone intimately, but it doesn't ever result in anything close to a traditional, like, romantic kind of tie, such as in the case of Silence of the Lambs, where, Hannibal is for the most part behind bars, but he and Clarice Starling have a intellectual intimacy, and he is able to use his skills as a therapist, as a psychiatrist. He is able to use those skills to get her to confront her past trauma and become the FBI agent that he knows that she's capable of being. And, insofar as, after having done that, being able to capture Buffalo Bill. And so, and he even hints at it, people will say we're in love, and you do get the sense that in whatever capacity Hannibal Lecter can love someone, you get the sense that he wants to make Clarice Starling into the best version of herself that she can be, because he sees that she's someone that doesn't fit in and isn't appreciated by the people that she's surrounded with, and he has a tendency to really despise the social hierarchy of what and the social strata of whatever environment he's in at the time. And so in that respect, yeah, they have a intellectual connection, and because they're both really, really smart individuals, but again, it doesn't manifest into what we would call a romance, even though it was released on Valentine's Day in 1991. And Jonathan Demme was like, this would be a great date movie, and it kind of was. Couples went to it, and it's like, you can kind of see it. And then, of course, this is more about, like, fandom, I suppose, but in Misery, you have Annie Wilkes, played beautifully by Kathy Bates. She thinks that she knows James Caan, Paul. She thinks that she knows his works and his characters. He's a writer. She thinks that he knows his stories better than he knows them, and feels like she has ownership over them in the way that a lot of really entitled fans, toxic fandom's a term that we use now, and this was before that term was used, but toxic fandom as a concept, it definitely, you could retroactively describe with this kind of story. And in which case a person feels like someone's, like, a character or characters or a franchise or a whatever is so personal to them, it becomes such a part of their identity that they feel a sense of ownership despite them not being the author, not being the artist. And so they do feel, in extreme cases, they feel a sense of intimacy with the author, and also when things aren't going their way, then they react in horrible ways. Like in real life, we had the harassment of the Ghostbusters actresses, and the people that got harassed thanks to the people who didn't like The Last Jedi and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, this kind of stuff definitely happens in real life, and you could chalk that up to perhaps romance, perhaps admiration, hero worship, some combination thereof. But yeah, perhaps with all that nonsense, perhaps conventional relationships aren't really for you. Maybe you're just looking to hook up with somebody random, or somebody not in any kind of serious way. You might be like our dear friend Emmanuel in this film, Emmanuel and the Last Cannibals. What's really interesting about this film, and I have not seen the other Black Emmanuel films that Laura Gemser was in, but what I found interesting about this film is, so she plays a journalist. Manuel is a journalist in this, and she is someone, this is 1977, so again, third wave feminism, sex positivity, sexual revolution from the 60s still carried over into the next decade. What you get in here is you get a woman who is globetrotting. She's very capable, but she's kind of like a female James Bond, in the sense that, like, she beds a guy without really thinking about it in any kind of serious way, and she's not like labeled a slut or anything, which is usually what you see with a woman that's like that. And she's not really portrayed in that way. She's portrayed as someone who is most definitely an exotic person, which Laura Gemser was. She was, I think, of Indonesian descent, and she was like a mixture of something, but she was someone that she didn't look like any of the usual types of people you would see in Western cinema, like here, it had Italian cinema specifically, but yeah, but she's someone that she's portrayed as being someone who is in charge of her own destiny, basically. And I found that, and you could say, oh, it's just an excuse to get nudity in film, and, possibly, but at the same time, like, I think that this Emmanuel has a level of agency and a level of self-determination that you wouldn't necessarily expect and is uncommon for a film of this type in this era. And because also the types of connections in there are far more in the realm of the casual and not really the serious. Or maybe your casual hookup or whatever, maybe it's because you're, a young person who doesn't want to be tied down yet, or perhaps you're in an extreme survival situation, or both, such as in the case of Cabin Fever. And, here you got both. You got young people that are just kind of horny all the time, but then you've also got extreme survival situations where this horrible disease it's in the water, quite literally, and, it's doing all kinds of horrible things to their bodies, and, you get the one girl who's like, you're in this, you're in a plane going down and you think you're gonna die, and so you just want to fuck the person next to you because you think you're both gonna die. And it's an interesting, we were talking about the fusion of sex and death in the cannibal video, and kind of similar situation here, except it's more of a survival kind of instinct of like that last kind of trying to latch on to something that's resembling life. And I do think that in some ways, I'm sure that coronavirus has probably brought about similar instincts in people. Perhaps not that extreme, but still. We're getting on the home stretch here. We're going to talk a little bit about some aspects of LGBTQ relationships in horror films. There are probably ones that deal with them more explicitly than some of the ones I have. And again, I don't have every horror film ever made yet. And I don't have every horror film that's specifically about this topic. I am sure that there are a ton more than the ones I have. These are just some of the ones that came to mind. And we're going to start with implicit, and we'll go up to more explicit. As far as implicit, you have something like, let's say, The Lighthouse here. And this is an amazing film. Highly, highly recommend it. Robert Eggers, who did The Witch, which you also know I really loved. This film is, I think, just as good. And in this film, you've got something that you will often see with a lot of male incidents of, like I'm speaking specifically during time periods in history where it wasn't really accepted or it wasn't common or whatever. Now, in this case, you get these two men that are manning a lighthouse together that's isolated. Well, it's kind of similar to something like Brokeback Mountain, where it's isolation, close proximity, having to contribute to a sense of duty, having to follow specific rules, trying to beat the boredom, and trying to, formulate some kind of connection with your partner to try to pass the time and to do your job better. And you'll see a lot of different things, different aspects of fiction, specifically involving men that are in those kinds of isolated but duty-bound situations, in which either explicit or implicit homosexuality or homoerotic situations occur. In this case, I think it's more homoerotic than it is explicit, but you do see some of the you do see a formulation of a deeper connection than is on the surface in here. And I think that's a common aspect of fiction when it involves two men that are somewhere isolated and they're bound by some kind of duty, and they have to connect in order to do the job better. And that connection can sometimes manifest in a deeper way. And yeah, it's more implicit here, but it's worth mentioning for sure. Um, and then if we're talking male homosexuality, then we have to mention Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, which this was something that it was definitely a product of its time in the sense that, you know, it was the 80s. The 80s was a time of kind of an increase in like Reagan era homophobia, and still, you know, it wasn't acceptable, you know, before, but it was more so of like, you know, the kinds of homosexuality that was arising in like the 70s was stuff like John Waters, where it was all like trying to be shocking and different and all that stuff. And then with the Reagan era, there was a big, you know, kind of backlash against that stuff, and there was still a lot of closetedness anyway. But like here, you had the main actor who was gay, and I don't think he ever explicitly said so, but I think people kind of figured it out on the set or whatever. And the writer and director, I guess that, well, they all claim to have not really noticed the like gay homoerotic undertones of the film. But then the star has said that he felt like they put it in there when they were, you know, kind of figuring him out a little bit. I think that it's such that the homoerotic undertones, you could almost argue that they become overtones because of how kind of amusingly kind of almost overt they become. But I think it's more so interesting when you look at it through the lens of, well, what went into it, but also the metaphor is that this teenage boy who is he's presumably interested in a girl, but he seems to have more of a connection with this male rival of his, and seems to be, yeah, he seems to have more chemistry with him, more of an interest in him, wanting to win his approval and that kind of stuff. And then as Freddy Krueger attempts to take over his body, he starts to do things that are more, at that time, kind of stereotypically associated with gayness, like going to a gay bar and, you know, things like that. And so you could definitely see it as a metaphor for that kind of burgeoning sense of oneself emerging from nothing, seemingly, or awakening at a time of puberty. So it's definitely worth watching through that lens. And again, it's definitely of its time. I don't think you would be able to do that kind of story in that same way today, and have it have the same impact, which again, people that were working on it, I guess, I've heard conflicting answers, but I think on the whole, people have said that they didn't really pick up on those undertones, but looking at it now, it's like you could almost, how could you not draw the comparison? And then you have some, on the female side, you have some examples of female homoeroticism. And with women, it often is kind of these friends that, you know, perhaps they admire each other and they're friendly and close with each other in some way, to where there is like a relatively natural means by which, you know, something small can turn into something more, or at least like an experimentation or whatever. And I think the stigma with girls, at least in our Western society, is such that it's such that more explicit expressions of homoerotic feelings are more commonplace to be shared and discussed. And the film I'm talking about is Jennifer's Body, where you know, Diablo Cody, who wrote it, admitted that she had kind of a girl crush on Megan Fox, which, you know, who wasn't into Megan Fox at that time. But here you've got the main character, Needy, and Jennifer, you know, who have been best friends for a while, but the relationship is kind of, the friendship is kind of bizarre, because it's like they shouldn't necessarily be friends, and yet they are, because, she's like this gorgeous, popular girl who's kind of, in a way, she's kind of using Needy, and it's even in her name, Needy. She's someone that doesn't sufficiently stand up for herself. And so once she becomes demonic and carnivorous, then she starts to not only assert her sexuality more overtly than she was before, but also she is doing something that, well, she like kisses, Needy, and it's such that, clearly there are these feelings that are coming up to the surface, or at least perhaps she's using it as a domination tactic or whatever, because that can also be a thing. I think it's perhaps some fusion of both, where it's like feelings buried underneath the surface coming out, or a form of control or whatever. But you definitely do see that, and I think that the expression of homoerotic feelings is more readily shared, at least in our culture, between that women are more comfortable with sharing the fact that they feel those feelings than men are, even though I imagine in terms of the numbers there's probably a comparable frequency of that. And then lastly, in this category, we're going to have something that talks about that far more explicitly. And it's a two-parter. It's Return to Nukem High Volumes 1 and 2, signed by Lloyd Kaufman. And far more explicit because it's set in modern day, number one, but also you've got our two main characters here, played by Catherine Cochran and Asta Paredes, who are two girls who they're kind of the odd couple in the sense that they really shouldn't like each other because one's poor, one's wealthy, and they have conflicts with each other, and they go to detention together and all this kind of stuff. They shouldn't. It's like the opposites attract kind of thing, but it's this idea of them kind of having their burgeoning sexuality in a place that I guess is more conservative. Tromaville, New Jersey, I guess, is very conservative on that front. And it's such that they do give in to their passion, and of course, traumatic wackiness ensues, the likes of which I don't even want to describe because it's best that you see these for yourself, and any description I could give would not do the craziness justice, I don't think. But rest assured, it is not disappointing, and I think that anybody that is a fan of romance would definitely appreciate this, because both stars have tremendously good chemistry, and you get the sense that they really do like each other. And I guess that the stars, that Catherine Cochran and Asta Paredes, I guess they do like each other as friends outside of the film, because I guess that she and Lloyd Kaufman and Pat Kaufman, I guess, went to Asta's wedding or something like that. But anyway, so that's a little bit more explicit. And then get on the home stretch here, so we got only a few that deal with things that are not healthy or illegal, or things that are not advisable, I suppose, or taboo or whatever, which I realized that I didn't put a Serbian film in here, which, I mean, you could say, like, the whole thing is, it's more so, like, I guess there you get into, like, pedophilia and stuff, and it's like, well, there's never a version of that that's acceptable, but I guess that there's no version of a lot of these things I'm about to talk about that are acceptable, but it's, I don't have it in front of me, but I guess you could just passingly say that, but, like, specifically talking about, relationships between, like, adults, presumably, that have it's more about I guess the reason I didn't put it in there is because I was thinking more about relationships that are unhealthy, that are usually, between people that are able to understand exactly what all is happening to them. And speaking of trauma, my personal favorite trauma film is Romeo and Juliet, which I don't know what you'd call this, if, horror, exploitation, romance, comedy, like, it kind of is Shakespeare adaptation. It's just kind of its own thing, but I bring it up because, spoiler alert, this version of the story, Romeo and Juliet, are brother and sister, and they're in an incestuous relationship, and they both live, and their babies are inbred, basically. And it's like, that's not, I don't think legal in most places, except for where they let you marry your cousin or something. And even then, like, the I guess that depending on like how far removed the cousin is, the cousins, like the instances of birth defects are less than they would be if they were brother and sister, obviously, but still the percentage is probably higher than if they were to be completely strangers. But yeah, I just brought that up because I don't know if you'd even call this a horror film, but I just brought it up because it's like, well, good on Lloyd for going where no one else would dare to go, and of course signed by Lloyd and James Gunn. Woo! And then we get into the delightful area of necrophilia with Necromantic and Necromantic 2, which, we're just talking about like people that could understand exactly what's happening to them, which is why I didn't put, Serbian film in there. And also because that's dealing with porn, and it's like, well, even if there was no, pedophilia or baby rape or whatever, it's like you're dealing with the production of porn, so it's like, that's a whole other area. It's not really a relationship, really. It's for work, but at any rate, necromantic, yeah, you would think, well, with having sex with a corpse, you're like, well, that corpse doesn't have any say in this thing, but it's, and I still need to watch these, but from what I remembered of the Cinema Snob's review of the first one, that it's a couple that gets, that does the nasty with a corpse, and so it becomes something that it kind of brings a couple together, and I wouldn't recommend it. Let me just say that. And then finally, the most romantic film of all time, Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom. Yeah, now if you want a film that is all about the complete absence of anything close to romance or human feeling or connection of any kind, then this is very much on that end of the spectrum. And I think that kind of brings us full circle, because we got from like the basic unit of measurement in romantic horror to some more healthy kind of levels of devotion of some kind, and then we get all the way down to the bottom of the barrel here. But yeah, so hopefully you found that interesting. Maybe you can relate to it. Maybe you see these films in a different way. Maybe you see aspects of your current relationship or your past relationships in here, or someone that you know. But we're definitely in uncharted waters in this environment with coronavirus, and with people's abilities to make meaningful connections with others being in new, different, uncharted territory. And I have to say for myself, having not been in a relationship since November, and having still been quite heartbroken about it, I don't know how I'll get out of, where I'm at right now, but it's always good to take an assessment of where other people are or where they can be, and a good way to do that is through the art that we all love. So if you like this, please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, set phasers to stun, warp factor 5. I will see you in the next video. I don't know when certain things will be arriving. The rate of acquisition is definitely slowed down because I gotta be a responsible adult and all that kind of stuff, but there'll be things coming down the pipeline, and of course we can do more videos like this if you like this sort of thing. So please let me know in the comments, and stay safe.